Hey guys, tonight we're going to wrap ourselves in brocade, light a torch, and walk slowly, very slowly, through the grand halls of medieval and early modern wealth. You're in a castle, but don't relax. Your breath fogs in the air, your boots slip on the drafty stone, and your feet have gone numb for the third time this evening. Welcome to luxury. The rich had it all, gleaming silver, silk robes, servants to stoke fires in a dozen hearths. And yet, you probably wouldn't survive a week. Forget the plagues and poisons for now. Tonight's discomfort is cozier. It's the kind that creeps into your bones, one creaky floorboard at a time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk barefoot, because why not suffer like a lord, across a floor colder than betrayal? Above you, rafters glisten with frost. There's a roaring fire somewhere in this maze, but it's likely warming a single room you're not invited into tonight. Even the grandest castles weren't built for comfort. They were stone fortresses first, insulation last. Historians still argue whether medieval castles were ever truly homes or just elaborate status symbols you happen to freeze inside. Central heating, obviously, hadn't been invented yet. You relied on fireplaces the size of small elephants to warm up maybe 10 feet around them. The rest? Drafty stone, and tapestries if you were lucky. And you couldn't just pile on fuzzy blankets. Wool was expensive, heavy, and scratchier than a public apology from a French monarch. Feather beds helped, but only if you had them. Many nobles, even in their fur-lined chambers, still slept under threadbare sheets. Why? Well, wealth distribution wasn't always as generous as it looked. In winter, frost formed on the inside of windows, if you had windows at all. Glass was a precious luxury, often reserved for churches and royal palaces. Most manor windows were open holes with wooden shutters. Air circulated freely, which sounds nice, until the wind howled at midnight and slapped you awake. By morning, your chamber pot has frozen over. That's not a metaphor. You kick it accidentally and hear it crack like a poorly cast bronze bell. Meanwhile, servants scurry with heated stones wrapped in linen, if you're very rich. If not, you spoon a lukewarm hunting hound and try not to think about its last bath. And here's a kicker, even the King's Palace at Versailles, arguably the most extravagant estate in European history, had icy corridors and underheated rooms. Louis XIV had to shuffle from one overheated chamber to another, his giant wigs bristling with cold sweat. The fire couldn't keep up with the vast marble hallways. Quirkier still? Rich folks sometimes chose to sleep sitting up. They feared that lying flat mimicked death and might invite the Grim Reaper to try his luck. So they propped themselves on pillows like unbaked croissants and dozed beneath layers of fur, embroidered cloth, and sheer regret. You lie in a grand four-poster bed, the canopy above heavy with embroidery and dust. There's a draft coming from the keyhole. Somewhere, you hear a distant owl, or maybe it's a servant coughing through a wall thin enough to whisper through. Either way, it reminds you you're not alone. And just when you think you've adjusted to the cold, you remember, you'll be woken at dawn for prayers. And if you're particularly noble, maybe a frostbitten ride to inspect your lands. So pull the covers tighter and try not to think about how luxury feels a lot like camping. In February. Without socks. You wake up stiff, shivering, and slightly suspicious that one of your toes might be gone. The four-poster bed groans as you shift, ornate, carved, and taller than most modern closets. It's the medieval equivalent of flexing on the neighbors. But oh, the irony, this luxurious fortress of slumber is a breeding ground for bugs. You don't just sleep alone. You share the bed with bedbugs, lice, and the occasional flea circus that performs impromptu acrobatics under your sheets. Linen is changed, eventually. Maybe once every few weeks. Maybe not at all if you're traveling. And your mattress? It's stuffed with straw or horsehair, and no, there's no orthopedic version. Still, the higher the bed, the closer to heaven, or at least that was the idea. Rich people slept high up on elaborate wooden frames, partly for status, partly to avoid the damp and rats scuttling on the cold stone floors. Historians still debate whether these beds were more ceremonial than comfortable, like royal thrones for unconscious bodies. And here's a delicious contradiction. While peasants often huddled together on hay piles for warmth and community, nobles often slept alone, or with servants standing nearby, staring, just in case you needed help breathing. Privacy wasn't a thing. Comfort, even less so. Bedding was a social announcement. Embroidered pillows, imported silks, and gold-threaded covers told a story of wealth, even if you were coughing through the night with a wool blanket over your face to keep the gnats out. Quilts became tokens of pride, sometimes handed down for generations, or, as happened more often, eaten by moths before they made it past one air. And it wasn't just the beds themselves, it was what went into them. One French noblewoman in the 1600s insisted her mattress be filled with swan feathers, claiming goose down was fit only for fishwives. Did it help her sleep? Probably not. But you can't put a price on snobbery. You shift again, careful not to rip the fabric under your knees. Beneath you, the bed creaks in a rhythm that matches the candlelight flickering on the damp walls. Candles, by the way, aren't relaxing mood setters here. They're stinky, they drip wax everywhere, and they're made of tallow, rendered animal fat, which smells like what it is. If you're lucky, beeswax candles offer a sweeter burn. But those were prized, hoarded, and used mainly in churches or by royalty. The rest of the upper class? They stewed in shadows and low-grade candle stench, waking up with wax blobs on their cloaks and the ever-present fear of lighting their drapes on fire. You look at the ceiling above. Suspended fabric panels, called testers, were meant to catch falling debris. Sounds elegant until you realize, castles crumble. Mice chew things. Bats nest in rafters. So that fancy canopy overhead? It's less about elegance, more about surviving the night without guanoing your hair. The truth is, rich people didn't just sleep badly. They performed sleep. Guests were shown the bedchamber like a gallery. Look, they'd say proudly, at the Turkish embroidery on this coverlet, no mention, of course, of the night sweats, creaking boards, or the servant in the corner who coughs politely every 20 minutes. And the bugs, did we mention the bugs? Beds were routinely fumigated with herbs, smoldering coals, or vinegar, but none of it worked very well. Travelers often brought their own sheets to inns or guest manors, not to avoid scandal, but to avoid scabies. A noble could die from politics, sure. But scabies? That was just another Tuesday. Even the concept of sleep hygiene was foreign. You'd sleep in your day clothes, maybe peel off a top layer, but rarely bathe before bed. Why? Because bathing was considered dangerous. It opened the pores and invited an illness, they thought. So, you'd bundle into bed with the same sweat and perfume you wore all day. And what about dreams? Nobles often believed dreams had prophetic power. So they'd wake, scribble down confusing fragments, and consult astrologers. That nightmare about being chased by a goat? Could be indigestion, or a warning from the stars. Historians still argue whether dream interpretation was taken seriously or just used as gossip fodder at breakfast. You roll over, one arm pinned awkwardly beneath a pillow that smells faintly of lavender and mildew. Somewhere outside, bells toll the early hour. Someone's already awake, probably lighting fires or sweeping ash. And you? You lie in a king's bed, draped in tapestries and wealth, and already dreading the next night of luxury. You stumble into the dining hall, bleary-eyed and sore from a night of aristocratic tossing and turning. The long table stretches absurdly far, littered with golden goblets, pewter plates, and candles tall enough to double as weapons. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is already being set. Spoiler, it smells ambitious. At first glance, the life of a rich eater looks enviable. Whole roasted boars, pastries stuffed with quince, silver trays of oysters arranged like edible jewelry. But peer a little closer, and the cracks begin to show, mostly in your teeth, but we'll get there. The feast is a display more than a meal. Most of what's served is for show. You wouldn't actually eat the roasted swan with gold leaf on its beak. That's just to impress guests and make lesser nobles question their tax bracket. The swan? It's been cooked 3 times over, dry as the moat outside. Historians still argue whether these ostentatious displays were ever meant to be consumed or simply admired before being scraped into buckets for the dogs and poor. Waste was a status symbol. If your table ended the night clean, you hadn't tried hard enough. But let's say you do bite into something. Maybe a meat pie shaped like a castle. Surprise! It's full of live songbirds that fly out as it's cut. Yes, really. They called it 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie, and it was meant to be delightful. You, ducking a startled sparrow at the breakfast table, are less enchanted. The food itself, when not airborne, was often heavily spiced. Why? not just for flavor. Spices were currency. Nutmeg, pepper, and saffron displayed wealth on your tongue. But also, the meat was sometimes questionable. That venison's been sitting out for a day or 3. Better mask it with clove and hope for the best. Oysters were another delicacy, considered an aphrodisiac and eaten with reckless abandon. Unfortunately, they were often harvested from polluted waters. No one knew what bacteria were yet, but nobles definitely knew how to spend the rest of the day hunched in a window alcove, regretting their breakfast choices. And then, of course, there was sugar. In the Renaissance, sugar was fashionably exotic. You eat candied violets, sugar-dusted almonds, and something that might be a molded marzipan hedgehog. It's adorable, and also probably full of lead-based coloring. Sugar was so prized it earned the nickname white gold. Too bad it also destroyed your teeth. You sip something to wash it down, maybe a goblet of wine, or if you're feeling refined, posset, a hot mix of milk, ale, and spices. Think curdled eggnog for nobles. Or perhaps a glass of medicinal wine mixed with ground pearls and coral. Why? Because apparently your intestines should feel like treasure chests. This abundance came with a price. Rich folks were constantly worried about poisoning, either by their enemies or their own kitchens. Tasting servants were a thing. Sometimes silver forks were tested against food, since silver was believed to turn black in the presence of poison. Spoiler, it doesn't. But paranoia never rests. And food wasn't eaten in peace. Oh no! Meals were a performance. Musicians played nearby, dogs begged underfoot, and servants stood in perfect formation, ready to refill your goblet or fan away the smell of boiling eels. You didn't dine to relax, you dined to win. Even table manners were ridiculous. You were supposed to dab your lips with bread, not napkins. You had to break your meat with your hands unless forks were available, and even then, they were considered suspiciously dainty by some. One bishop famously called forks an affront to God's design. He also died of food poisoning. Coincidence? You look down at your plate, now smeared with a reddish glaze that might be sauce, or fruit, or something else. You're full, but also weirdly unsatisfied. The food is rich, but not nourishing. The flavors clash in your mouth, and your stomach swirls with the kind of unease that only luxury can bring. By the end of the meal, your fingers are sticky, your breath is a cocktail of garlic and goose fat, and someone's falcon just landed on the table and tried to steal a pheasant leg. You rise, slowly, half dizzy, and you realize something. For all this grandeur, you might prefer a bowl of plain porridge. Now that your goose fat breakfast is rattling in your stomach like a questionable decision, it's time to get dressed. Not dressed like throw on something comfy dress. Oh no! You, my wealthy friend, are about to be swaddled like a human parfait. Layer upon itchy layer. The process starts with your undergarments, likely a linen chemise or shirt, which you haven't washed in a week. Not because you're lazy, but because laundering is expensive, slow, and risks shrinking your precious imported fabrics. So, instead, you change less often and mask the aroma with herbs sewn into your sleeves. Very fancy. Very pungent. Next comes the padding, then the over-padding. Maybe a corset or doublet. Then 2 or 3 tunics or gowns, depending on your gender and how many people you're trying to outdress today. Rich women might add farthingales, hoop-like cages under their skirts that make walking feel like navigating doorways with a small boat strapped to your hips. And you can't dress yourself, of course. You have attendants. Dressing is a ceremony, a performance, a measure of your rank. The more complicated your outfit, the more servants it takes to tie, button, lace, and adjust it. It's not uncommon for nobles to spend hours each morning preparing to be seen for 5 minutes. Historians still argue whether this ritual was rooted more in vanity or politics. Some say the meticulous layering of garments mirrored the layers of courtly hierarchy. Others think people just got bored and wanted to spend time fiddling with buttons. Either way, your arms can't move properly by the end of it. Let's talk fabrics. Velvet, silk, brocade, each imported at enormous cost and stiff enough to stand on its own. These weren't breathable materials. You sweat. A lot. And your body, encased in fashion armor, has no choice but to stew in it. Linen underlayers absorb what they can, but they only do so much. Quirkier still, some outfits are designed not just for looks, but to carry hidden messages. The more extravagant your sleeves, the more wealth you show, since extra fabric was taxed in some cities. Buttons, oddly, were often non-functional, purely decorative. And sometimes your shoes were mismatched on purpose. a flex, an aesthetic, a trip hazard. Men had it no easier. They wore codpieces, those glorified fabric pouches meant to emphasize masculinity while also doubling as small storage compartments. Yes, some held coins or love notes. Imagine trying to sit in one of those gracefully. You can't. Even chairs were nervous. And while we're at it, let's talk collars. Those enormous starched ruffs from the Elizabethan era weren't just for drama. They were symbols of wealth, soaked in starch and ironed with hot pokers to maintain that absurd, frilly shape. Wearing one was like balancing a doily on your neck while trying not to sneeze. Your hair isn't spared either. Depending on the century, it's either slicked with lard, perfumed with rosewater, or hidden entirely under a bejeweled coif or powdered wig. The wig, by the way, is so dense you might trap heat like a human pressure cooker. And yes, there are living things in it. We'll get to that later. One noblewoman in France famously wore a 3-foot-high wig that included a miniature ship to commemorate a naval victory. Historians still debate whether this was genuine patriotism or just the 1700s version of Instagram cosplay. Either way, you couldn't sit in a carriage without cracking a window, or your neck. Of course, all this finery isn't comfortable. The fabrics chafe. The shoes pinch. The lace scratches. And yet, being rich means being seen. Fashion is suffering. You don't wear clothes, you carry them, like an overcooked roast, sweating and wobbling under the weight of status. Now dressed, you prepare to descend a stone staircase that doesn't believe in railings. Your shoes are made of thin leather, with soles that slide on mossy tile like soap on wet marble. You grab a tapestry for balance. It nearly rips. Ah, luxury. And all of this? Just to stroll the gardens and pretend you're not freezing, faint, and slightly lopsided. You smile through it, because appearances matter. Even if your thighs are chafed, your corset is digging into your ribs, and your wig smells faintly of lavender and despair. You stand in your 12-layered misery, clutching a silk handkerchief you'll never actually use, and realize something horrifying: nature calls. And in a world before plumbing, relieving yourself becomes a logistical puzzle, especially if you're wearing 3 petticoats, 2 girdles, a steel corset, and a prayer. Let's not sugarcoat it. Medieval and early modern sanitation for the wealthy was theatrical. You didn't exactly waltz into a private porcelain suite. If you were lucky, your castle had a garderobe, a narrow stone closet perched high on the outer wall, with a wooden seat above a hole that dropped waste into the moat below. Romantic, isn't it? Historians still argue whether these setups were ever cleaned regularly, or if castle moats basically functioned as open-air latrines. Some believe herbs were tossed down to mask the smell, others say even the guards refused to stand near the outer wall. Either way, the ambience was less Versailles and more barnyard rave. But most of the time, you use a chamber pot, which sounds quaint until you realize it's literally a decorated bowl you keep under the bed or behind a screen. You squat, aim, pray, and hope your servants know not to knock. Rich people had pots made of pewter, silver, even porcelain, because nothing says elegance like urinating into a priceless artifact. And once you're done, a servant carries it away, ideally without sloshing. In cities like Paris or London, household waste was flung from windows with a courteous shout, "Garde low," which meant watch out for the water. Of course, it wasn't water. And if you didn't move fast enough, congratulations, you've been baptized in aristocratic regret. Bathing, meanwhile, was rare. The rich did it maybe once a month, maybe. Water was considered suspicious. Bathhouses were associated with disease and sin. Many nobles believed that washing too often stripped away protective oils and invited sickness. You freshen up by dabbing perfume behind your ears and brushing your teeth with burnt breadcrumbs. To be fair, there were luxurious exceptions. Some Roman villas, and later, Islamic palaces, boasted sophisticated bath systems with heated floors and elaborate water channels. But these were outliers. Even royalty often bathed in wooden tubs dragged into the bedroom, filled with buckets of lukewarm water. It took hours, several servants, and left your floor a swamp. And privacy? Forget it. Bathing was often a social act. Noblewomen invited guests to sit nearby and chat while they were scrubbed. Yes, you're sitting in a tub, and Lady Marguerite is reading poetry 3 feet away while sipping almond milk. You can't make this up. There were gadgets. The closed stool, for instance, a kind of early toilet hidden inside a padded wooden chair. You sit, you lift the cushion, and voila! It's disguised dignity. Some even came with armrests and embroidered backs, as if royalty needed lumbar support while doing their business. Of course, none of this addresses the smell. Homes were heavy with it. Perfume didn't just mask body odor, it battled the larger fog of chamber pots, unwashed fabrics, and damp stone. You burned incense. You placed orange peels on the floor. You stuffed flowers in your pockets. You prayed. One 17th century Parisian noble was said to have spritzed his wig with rosewater every hour to mask the scent of his powdered scalp and whatever else was nesting in there. Another kept live herbs stitched into his doublet, like a walking salad bar with a scent problem. To make it worse, plumbing innovations didn't spread fast. Even when flush toilets appeared in the 16th century, they were seen as gimmicks or unreliable curiosities. Queen Elizabeth I had one installed, and promptly ignored it. The old chamber pot worked just fine, thank you very much. And in palaces, especially the larger ones, servants often emptied pots into designated waste channels, which ran directly under the floorboards or outside along the building. You didn't see it, but you smelled it. Always. And on warm days? Let's just say you understood why aristocrats built separate summer residences. So here you are, back in your brocade nightmare, buttoned up to the throat, desperately needing relief. You had the pot under the bed, your foot already tangled in lace. It's either this or a treacherous hike to the garderobe, where you might freeze midstream. And you thought being rich meant luxury. It mostly means aiming well and walking carefully. You survived the chamber pot, barely, and now it's time to enjoy one of the few indulgences the wealthy truly treasured, warmth. At least, that's the hope. Because in a world before thermostats and double-pane windows, getting warm was less a given and more an expensive, hazardous adventure. You trudge into the great hall where a fire the size of your ego crackles on a giant hearth. It's impressive, yes. But unless you're standing within 3 feet of it, your toes are still frozen. Castles were built to defend against invaders, not to trap heat. Stone absorbs the cold like a grudge. Some nobles, especially in southern Europe or parts of the Middle East, had more sophisticated setups. Romans, for example, perfected the hypocaust system, a kind of ancient underfloor heating powered by furnaces and circulating air. Sounds dreamy, right? It was. If you didn't mind the occasional structural collapse or carbon monoxide incident. Historians still argue whether these systems were practical for large domestic use or just expensive novelties for the elite. Either way, they were rare. For most of Europe's rich, staying warm meant layering clothes, sitting near the fire, or depending on portable heat sources, like foot warmers, hot stones, or even heated bricks wrapped in cloth. These heat sources came with a price. Ever tried sleeping next to a pan of smoldering coals tucked under your bed? Cozy, until the linens catch fire. And they did, frequently. It's estimated that many noble homes saw at least one bedchamber blaze during their lifespan. Some just considered it part of the furniture's natural life cycle. More portable, the brazier. Picture a metal dish filled with burning charcoal, carried around the house like a dangerous tea tray. You'd sit beside it, warming your fingers while silently praying it didn't tip. One distracted cat, and suddenly you're hosting an impromptu indoor bonfire. And then there was the rushlight, a budget version of the candle made of dried rushes dipped in animal fat. They flickered. They stank. They sputtered out at the worst possible moment. But they were cheaper than beeswax, and better than nothing if you were stumbling around a dark hallway in search of a chamber pot. One nobleman in 15th century England reportedly paid for 4 rushlights per evening, no more, and kept a ledger to make sure no servant got extra light on the sly. That's what passed for energy budgeting in the medieval world. But perhaps the most ironic part of heating luxury homes? The grand fireplaces. Often so large they required full tree trunks to burn. They looked amazing in tapestries. In reality, most of the heat soared right up the chimney, while the smoke stayed in gently suffocated the dinner guests. You sit in your drawing room, bundled in fur and velvet, huddled beside a fire that roars like a dragon and somehow still doesn't warm your knees. You sip mulled wine, hoping the cloves numb the chill in your fingers. And just as you start to feel your cheeks defrost, someone opens a door down the hall, and the entire room sighs into cold again. Drafts were everywhere. No insulation. Gaps under doors, cracks between beams, windows that rattled in their frames. Rich homes had tapestries not just to decorate walls, but to try to keep out wind. These wall hangings weren't art. They were functional, like extremely expensive and flammable wallpaper. Let's not forget the upper floors. Heat rises, sure, but not fast enough. The higher you slept in a tower or manor, the colder it got. Some nobles refused to live upstairs entirely. Those who did often wore nightcaps, gloves, and even bedcoats, yes, coats specifically designed for sleeping. Fashionable insomnia, sponsored by hypothermia. If you were truly elite, you might have access to something extravagant, a tiled stove, particularly in Eastern Europe. Beautiful, efficient, and shockingly effective at holding heat. Of course, importing one was a nightmare, and maintaining it required servants with both skill and fireproof optimism. So here you are again, shivering in splendor. The logs crackle, your hands hover over a metal dish full of coal, and your embroidered slippers are dangerously close to bursting into flames. Luxury, it turns out, is not for the faint of heart or cold of foot. You might be rich, but you're definitely not smiling. Or if you are, it's through clenched gums and a carefully managed wince. Because your teeth, your poor, ruined, sugar-rotted teeth, are the unsung tragedy of your luxurious life. You pluck a candied fig from a silver tray and hesitate. It glistens, oozing syrup, smelling of cloves and opulence. But you know this bite might cost you another molar. You eat it anyway. You're rich. What's a little pain, as long as your sweet tooth gets its fix? Sugar was the ultimate status symbol. Imported at great cost from far-off colonies, it was carved into sculptures, poured into sauces, and sprinkled like fairy dust on everything from veal to cucumbers. Historians still argue whether medieval and Renaissance palates were truly that sweet-obsessed or whether the upper class simply binged to flaunt their wealth. You definitely binged. Nobles consumed sugar in staggering amounts. It sweetened wine, meat, bread, even medicines. You had sugar loaves shaped like temples. Marzipan molded into fake fruits. Syrup pickled roses. Everything was sugar-coated, sometimes literally, like your fruit pies encased in hardened icing the thickness of guilt. And the result? A mouthful of regret. Dentists didn't exist, at least not how you'd hope. Barber surgeons doubled as tooth pullers, wielding iron pliers with the finesse of a blacksmith. If your tooth ached, you were offered clove oil, a prayer, and a chair to grip. The pain was, shall we say, character building. Tooth loss wasn't just expected, it was fashionable. Blackened stumps became a noble's badge of indulgence. You might lose all your front teeth by 30, and nobles in France and England proudly smiled through their gaps like it was the price of admission to high society. One fringe remedy included rinsing with urine. Another involved pressing roasted onion to the cheek while whispering charms. Both, it turns out, were only slightly more effective than simply weeping in a candlelit corridor. Still, these were preferred to having your tooth yanked without anesthetic, though whine and screaming were common accessories. If your jaw deteriorated too much, you could invest in false teeth, usually carved from ivory, bone, or someone else's teeth. Real human teeth were popular, harvested from the dead or poor and sold at a premium. You could be chewing duck with the incisors of a soldier from last week's skirmish. George Washington may have lived later, but his mythic wooden teeth have a long ancestry. Earlier nobles wore mouthpieces so cumbersome they had to slur their way through royal declarations. One duchess was said to use a silver palate just to form her sounds, still more elegant than mumbling with rotting gums. And the breath, let's talk about the breath. Without modern hygiene, your mouth was a war zone. You chewed mint leaves or fennel seeds to mask the stench. Some people sucked on cloves or cinnamon sticks like fancy toothpicks. There were even tooth powders made of crushed coral and burnt shell. Refreshing and abrasive. Despite all this, smiling was still part of courtly life. You were expected to charm, flirt, and flatter through a mouthful of decay. Portraits from the time rarely show teeth, and now you know why. Those tight-lipped smiles weren't modesty. They were self-defense. You bite another sweetmeat. Something crunches that shouldn't. You freeze, tongue probing a sudden void. Another casualty. You wave away the servant offering more tarts, your jaw aching like a cathedral bell tower after mass. And yet, you keep eating. Because indulgence is your birthright. Comfort is fleeting, and sweets, brief as they are, taste like power. You don't stop because you can't. After all, being rich means never having to say maybe that's enough marzipan. You leave the dining hall with your aching jaw and a loose tooth rattling around like a relic in your mouth. Time to relax. Perhaps some entertainment will take your mind off the slow implosion happening behind your smile. You drift toward the solar, a cozy upper chamber, supposedly warm and inviting, where noble families gather for music, needlework, and polite gossip. The room greets you with a familiar blend of smoke, damp velvet, and the faint, sweet scent of beeswax polish. A lute plinks in the corner. Tentatively, someone's been practicing the same 3 notes for what feels like a century. A servant enters with a steaming bowl of something, maybe mulled wine or boiled herbs, which does nothing to lift the mood. Entertainment for the rich was meant to be cultured, but it could be surprisingly grim. Minstrels sang ballads about doomed lovers and knights who died gruesomely in ditches. The more tragic, the better. Laughter was welcome, but only if it was wry and tinged with suffering. A proper noble was expected to find existential dread elegant. Historians still argue whether nobles truly enjoyed this sort of melancholy performance, or if they simply pretended to like it for the sake of appearances. After all, a good cry during a harp solo said, "I'm sensitive and well-bred," while sleeping through it suggested peasantry in your bloodline. Meanwhile, scurrying beneath your feet, something stirs. Mice. Always mice. Even in the finest households, rodents were an expected part of life. You hear one scrabble behind the wainscoting. No one reacts. They're part of the ambience, like cracks in the fresco or the ever-present whiff of burning tallow. One lady rises to perform a verse she's written, and you try not to sigh. The poem is long, meandering, and vaguely threatening in its use of metaphors involving plagues, winter, and a dying rose bush. You applaud politely, because to do otherwise might result in social death, or worse, being forced to perform next. On lucky nights, you might enjoy a performance by traveling musicians or even a fool. Court jesters weren't just clowns. They were sometimes the only ones allowed to speak the truth, as long as it was wrapped in riddles and fart jokes. One famous jester once insulted a duke's wig and lived to tell the tale, barely. You shift in your chair, stiff from the weight of your garments and the lack of proper cushioning. Rich people's furniture was beautiful but rarely comfortable. Carved wood, maybe a velvet cushion, and that was it. You didn't lounge. You perched, like a fashionable gargoyle. The room grows warmer as more bodies enter. Someone plays a psaltery, an early stringed instrument that sounds like a harp and a typewriter had a nervous child. Children run through the doorway, laughing too loudly, and are promptly shushed. Children were meant to be seen, not heard, unless they were performing a dance, which they now must do. A boy with flushed cheeks and a tattered ribbon tries to keep time while stepping carefully in shoes too tight. It's charming in a sad kind of way. You remember being made to dance, too, while your shoes bled you quietly from both heels. Then come the shadow plays. Candlelight, cut paper, and trembling silhouettes on a sheet stretched across a frame. The stories are often moral tales. Pride, punished, generosity, rewarded, donkeys, mysteriously wise. A lady to your left weeps softly at a story about a blind beggar who returns a stolen ring to a king. And yet, for all its intention, the entertainment rarely distracts you from the underlying discomfort. The room is too warm now. Your wig itches. A mouse skitters directly across the floor and disappears under the cushion next to yours. You don't flinch. No one does. Occasionally, you get more dramatic events. A visiting noble recounts a hunt, or a priest shares a grim miracle tale involving bleeding saints and divine punishments. Everyone nods thoughtfully, sipping warm wine and wondering when it'll be polite to leave. Finally, a bell sounds, the signal that evening prayer approaches. You rise stiffly, knees cracking like kindling. The music winds down. The children are whisked away. The candles sputter. You step out of the solar and into the hallway, where the cold wraps around you like a wet glove. Music, mice, and the mild misery of being rich. It's all very cultured. And completely exhausting. You shuffle toward the door, the sound of your silk slippers brushing against the stone floor oddly loud in the chill. You've been invited, summoned, really, to visit one of your estates a few miles away. A short journey, you're told. Just an hour or two on the road. Which is how you find yourself being hoisted into what might loosely be called a carriage, but feels more like a mobile confession booth with wheels made from judgment and discomfort. Travel, for the wealthy, was not a delight. It was a test of endurance. And no amount of embroidery on the curtains can change the fact that you're about to be jostled like a sack of turnips. The coach lurches forward. You lurch with it. You grip a velvet handle and try to pretend you're enjoying the countryside, even as your head bounces against the wall and your teeth chatter from the ruts in the road. The springs, if there are any, are about as forgiving as a papal edict. Historians still argue whether carriage design improves life on the road or just added new kinds of suffering. Sure, they kept you out of the mud, but they turned your spine into a corkscrew. The wheels groan over cobblestones, and every pothole feels personal. You pass a group of peasants walking barefoot, and for a moment, you envy them. At least they get to stretch their legs. You, on the other hand, are stuffed into a gilded box alongside two distant cousins and a small dog with a phobia of sudden stops. The dog whimpers as the coach hits a bump the size of an emotional wound. Your cousin complains about the smell from outside. You try not to admit it's probably coming from inside, more specifically, from the traveling chamber pot tucked under the seat. That's right. It's portable misery. And it sloshes. And did we mention dust? The countryside is dry this time of year, and fine dirt blows through every seam in the carriage. You taste it in your teeth. You wipe it from your eyes. By the time you arrive, your elaborate outfit has taken on the same sad beige hue as the roads you regretted. If it rains, it's worse. Water leaks through the seams in rhythmic plops. If you're not in a covered coach, you ride on a saddle soaked in cold drizzle, your cloak clinging to your back like a second, wetter skin. The mud flies up into your face, spattering your embroidered gloves with the earth's version of mockery. Let's not forget the smells. Passing through towns and villages means enduring the aromatic blend of dung, tanneries, and fish markets that haven't seen ice since the last ice age. You hold a perfumed kerchief to your nose and silently wish yourself back into your freezing chamber, where at least the stench was familiar. There's a brief moment of peace as the carriage pauses at a narrow bridge. You hear birds. You see a patch of wildflowers. Then your driver yells at someone's goat, the wheel creaks alarmingly, and you're nearly thrown into your cousin's lap. The dog throws up. Everyone pretends not to notice. One particularly adventurous noble in the 17th century attempted to travel by sedan chair over a mountain trail, carried by 4 men. The journey ended with 2 sprained ankles, a broken arm, and a vow to never leave the garden again. Travel wasn't romantic, it was a contact sport. Some carriages were luxury models with cushions, mirrors, and even bookshelves. Which sounds nice until you hit a bump and the copy of Psalms for the Weary Soul flies off and clocks you in the temple. You are not soothed. Still, you keep going. Because being seen traveling is part of your image. Your arrival must be dramatic. Your cloak must billow. Your hat must remain perched at an angle that says, I suffer, but beautifully. And when you finally arrive, back cracked, hair frizzed, ego bruised, you're helped down from the coach like royalty returning from war. Your servants pretend not to notice your limp. The dog stumbles out, eyes haunted. You nod to your steward as if to say, ah yes, a lovely journey, and collapse inside the house like a beached relic. But don't worry. You'll get to do it all again next week. You settle into your host's parlor, your legs still vibrating from the carriage trauma, hoping for a moment of peace. But instead, the servant arrives bearing a silver tray, not with tea or mulled wine, but with something far more insidious, perfume. A dozen little glass vials, stoppered and sparkling. Because nothing says relax like slathering yourself in chemicals designed to hide the fact that no one has bathed. You select one bottle, dab its contents behind your ears, and promptly sneeze. It smells like lilies, leather, and maybe formaldehyde. You're not sure. But everyone else is doing it, and you can't be the only one in the room who smells like carriage dog and velvet mold. Why the obsession with scent? Simple, bathing was rare, and deodorant hadn't been invented. Wealthy people, for all their finery, sweated just as much as anyone else, more, even, with all those layers. So instead of soap and water, they turned to perfume. Not just dabs behind the ears, but full body saturation. Like marinating in expensive denial. Historians still argue whether the nobility genuinely preferred perfume to bathing, or if they simply feared the water too much to consider soap a viable option. Pores open during baths, the doctors warned, and bad humors enter the body, you might emerge clean, but vulnerable to disease. Better to stay ripe and armored. And stay ripe, they did. Rich households reeked of scent. Not one scent, layers of them. Rose oil layered over ambergris, which, fun fact, is whale intestine vomit, topped with musk, from the glands of musk deer, with a garnish of lavender, cinnamon, or civet, collected from cat-like animals' anal secretions. Bon appetit. perfume wasn't just survival, it was status. Some nobles wore different scents for different times of day. Morning musk, afternoon rose, evening something mysterious and vaguely threatening. There were perfumed gloves, perfumed wigs, even perfumed handkerchiefs to dab at your perfume-soaked forehead. You couldn't breathe, but by God, you smelled wealthy. You crossed the room to sit near the hearth, careful not to wrinkle your brocade. The lady of the house offers you a pomander, a small orb filled with herbs and spices you can carry or hang from your belt. You thank her, knowing full well it won't help. The smell of mildew, damp stone, and centuries-old upholstery is woven into the furniture. The fireplace, meant to warm the room, mostly just churns the smells like a slow-motion perfume blender. You try not to gag. Your nostrils are assaulted by competing floral notes, dog breath, and something that might be your host's perfumed wig gently cooking beside the fire. And let's talk about that wig. We'll get to the critters inside it later, but for now, focus on the scent. Wigs were dusted with powder, usually rice flour, often scented with orris root or lavender. After a few hours of wear, combined with sweat and candle smoke, the effect was layered. One eccentric French courtier had his wigs dusted with violet powder every hour on the hour. Another preferred his perfumed with lemon zest and clove. But over time, the powder built up. Like a fashionable cake of regret, wigs were rarely cleaned. Instead, more perfume. Always more perfume. And the furniture? Also scented. Cushions were stuffed with herbs. Drapes soaked in aromatic oils. Even writing desks were sometimes rubbed with lemon balm or mint. It was all meant to signal luxury, but the effect was dizzying. You didn't sit. You endured. Of course, not everyone loved the olfactory chaos. There were quiet protests, ladies fainting at balls, gentlemen developing mysterious headaches. One noble in Florence had special clean air rooms constructed, filled with unperfumed linen and potted plants. He was mocked by his peers for smelling like nothing, how vulgar. But you sit, breathing through your handkerchief, wondering how long you must stay before it's polite to excuse yourself. The fire crackles. Someone enters wearing so much jasmine oil you can taste it in your throat. You blink through the haze, smile politely, and try not to pass out. So yes, being rich means you don't smell like a peasant. But you don't smell like a person either. You smell like a florist and an apothecary got into a fistfight, and no one won. You managed to escape the scented parlor under the pretense of checking on your dog, who, by the way, is now curled under a settee, vibrating softly and likely traumatized for life. You tiptoe down the corridor, hoping for a moment of solitude. But as you pass a mirror, something catches your eye. Your wig. It's crooked. And possibly alive. Wigs were the crown jewels of aristocratic fashion, powdered, perfumed, and piled high with curls sculpted like whipped meringue. But underneath? A hotbed of secrets, both social and biological. You straighten yours with the help of 2 pins and a prayer, trying not to disturb whatever's nesting inside. Let's not pretend it's just powder in there. Wigs were rarely cleaned, often reused, and kept on dusty stands between wearings. Lice loved them. Fleas vacation there. Even moths got cozy. You, noble and refined, are basically hosting a vermin B&B on your scalp. Historians still argue whether the rich genuinely didn't notice or simply didn't care. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was the sheer pressure to conform. Maybe, deep down, they knew, but weren't willing to admit that wealth came with a side of critters. You duck into the dressing room to adjust your look. Your valet enters with fresh powder, a puff of rice flour scented with lavender. He pats your wig with mechanical calm, while tiny particles float into the air and settle on your lashes, your collar, the dog, everything. You resist the urge to sneeze. Nobility does not sneeze. The powder, by the way, isn't just decorative. It's meant to mask the oils, the smells, and the living population on your head. Think of it as dry shampoo with delusions of grandeur. You look in the mirror again. Better. Not perfect. But no one will see the flea bite behind your ear unless you faint in the middle of a dance. And oh, the dance. Wigs weren't just for show. They were social armor. The taller, the better. Some had themes, ships, fruit baskets, entire gardens sculpted from horsehair and beeswax. There's a story of one duchess in Vienna who had a working miniature windmill installed in her wig. It squeaked rhythmically throughout a state dinner. The inconvenience? Immense. You couldn't sit without tilting. You couldn't hug anyone without taking them out. You couldn't enter a carriage without removing part of the doorframe. Fashionable ceilings were literally raised to accommodate the hairstyles of the rich. Your head was the reason for architectural renovation. Men wore wigs, two shorter, white powdered ones for court, longer curls for balls, and occasionally comically tiny ones for hunting. A powdered wig said, "I'm powerful, wealthy, and possibly riddled with dandruff I don't want you to see." And there were politics in wigs. You could be a Whig or a Tory, but if your curls were too French, you might be accused of harboring foreign sympathies. There were laws regulating how much powder could be used, taxes on wig hair, and public mockery for those whose styles were a few months behind trend. Let's not forget the servants. Wig makers were an entire class of artisan, trained to construct elaborate towers of hair and illusion. They boiled, curled, and dyed human and animal hair into sculptures of ego. One master wig maker in Paris once fainted while installing a 4-foot wig under time pressure. His client refused to pay. "You dropped your comb," she reportedly said. You step back into the hallway, wig now fully repowdered and pinned. It feels like a helmet, warm and gently humming with secrets. You nod at a passing nobleman whose own wig seems to list slightly to starboard. He nods back. There's a silent understanding. Neither of you is in charge of your hair anymore. Your head itches. You pretend it doesn't. You resist scratching. Scratching is for peasants. Instead, you lift your chin and glide forward like the powder-dusted deity you are. Every flake of rice flour a badge of suffering. Every twitch beneath the curls a gentle reminder, you're rich. You've earned this. As evening draws near and the candles cast soft halos on the gilded moldings, you find yourself drawn to the jewelry table, because nothing says I'm still trying like fastening on 10 pounds of danger disguised as sparkle. Ah yes, the jewels. Gleaming rubies, heavy golden rings, and earrings the size of childhood regrets. You choose a necklace, something subtle, just 3 strands of pearls and a central pendant roughly the size of a robin's egg. You clasp it around your neck, ignoring the mild pinprick sensation. That's not nerves. That's lead. You see, being rich also meant glowing, but not in the good way. Many luxury accessories and cosmetics used by the nobility were, quite literally, toxic. Arsenic, mercury, and lead were common ingredients in everything from rouge to eyeliner. Because what is wealth, really, if not a slow, sparkling descent into organ failure? Historians still argue whether nobles were aware of these dangers or blissfully in denial. Some suggest that by the 1700s, suspicions were circulating. But when the mirror shows you a perfectly pale face, do you really care what it's made of? Probably not. Especially when everyone else at court is also lightly dissolving from the neck up. You powder your face, thickly. A paste of vinegar, white lead, and sometimes even crushed pearls. The result? That alabaster glow prized in every portrait. Never mind that your skin is cracking beneath it, that your eyebrows have been singed off by tweezers heated over flame. The final effect is ethereal and faintly radioactive. Your lips, of course, must be red. For that, you reach for a pot of vermilion, a brilliant hue made from cinnabar, which is mercury sulfide. Yes, that mercury. A quick dab here, a smudge there. Add in a little soot or beetle extract, and voila. Your dinner party ready and one step closer to hallucinations. And don't forget the eye makeup. Belladonna was sometimes used to dilate pupils, giving you a soft, doe-eyed look. It also blurred vision and occasionally led to blindness. But beauty, as always, is worth squinting for. Jewelry itself wasn't exactly safe either. Green pigments and gemstones were sometimes derived from copper arsenite, so yes, your earrings might be poisoning your bloodstream while you're sipping wine and pretending not to judge your cousin's embroidery. That tiara? Lovely. Also probably outgassing something sinister. You slide a ring onto your finger. The ruby glints red in the candlelight. Beneath it, your skin is already starting to itch. You ignore it. A little rash is nothing. You once wore a necklace so tight it left a scar across your collarbone. It became a talking point at court, how she suffers so gracefully. And speaking of suffering, medicine. Wealth gave you access to all the finest treatments, which unfortunately included things like bloodletting, mercury tonics, and leeches. You feel faint? Try drinking a solution of gold dust and crushed emeralds. Upset stomach? Swallow a bezoar, basically a rock formed in an animal's stomach. Supposedly magical. Definitely not. There's a physician in your court who swears by the blue pill, a mercury-laced concoction that clears up skin and irritability. You've seen people smile while their teeth fall out, convinced the medicine is working. You're not sure if it is, but you keep taking it, because no one wants to be the one with a spot on their chin. Even the healing balms weren't safe. Ointments might include powdered toad, burnt antler, or crushed coral. You once wore a patch behind your ear soaked in vinegar, meant to ward off plague miasma. It also gave you hives, but it made you smell like commitment to health. You glance at your reflection, flawless skin, temporarily, gleaming jewelry, possibly carcinogenic, and eyes with just a hint of hasn't slept in 3 days. You look like wealth. You look like power. You look like someone who might faint during a toast and still make it seem fashionable. So yes, you're shining tonight. Just don't scratch that necklace-shaped rash. Or smile too hard, the lead might crack. You glide into the reception room, every poison jewel in place, every curl frozen in powdered defiance, and settle onto a carved settee that squeaks beneath its own sense of obligation. Around you, conversation murmurs like a slow leak in a grand old ship, genteel, polite, and absolutely crawling with subtext. You're not just mingling. You're surviving a silent war. Because here's the thing about luxury, you're never really alone. You may have privacy in theory, but not in practice. Every moment of your opulent life is attended, observed, and quietly judged by the people who dress you, feed you, and know which drawer you hide your more embarrassing ointments in. Servants. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds, if your estate is big enough. And they're always there. Folding linens, pouring wine, pretending not to hear you mutter something scathing about the Duke's eyebrows. But they do hear. They hear everything. They know everything. And sometimes, they whisper. Historians still debate just how much power domestic staff wielded. Some argue they were voiceless laborers, working under constant threat. Others point out that a sharp-tongued maid or a valet with a good memory could unmake reputations overnight. And given how often nobles were caught in scandals, the servants were probably just better at keeping secrets until it paid to spill them. You catch the eye of your personal maid, standing near the wall, hands folded. She knows too much. She's seen you weeping into your wig powder, has helped lace up dresses over bruises from corsets too tight, and once spent 3 hours picking fleas out of a cape you insisted was made of clean mink. She knows who really fathered your cousin's child. She knows which bishop drinks laudanum laced with wine and mutters apologies to the wallpaper. She knows which lady in green has been stealing combs from guests since Epiphany. And she's not alone. The entire household is a breathing, silent network of intelligence. The butler who observes what letters come and go. The cook who overhears whispers in the pantry. The footman who stands outside your door long enough to know you cry after parties. Every servant has stories. And some have ambitions. You've heard of blackmail, of course. Of letters that mysteriously fall into the wrong hands. Of a misplaced handkerchief leading to a duel. One stable boy in Naples ended up marrying a countess after discovering a certain duke's fondness for cross-dressing on Sundays. Leverage, it turns out, can be found in unlaundered linens. Some nobles attempt to fight back by fostering loyalty. Gifts, tokens, bonuses during holidays. You once gave your lady's maid a brooch. She looked at it, smiled, and said, "It's lovely, my lady," which might have meant she adored it, or that she knew you regifted it from the Polish ambassador's wife. Then there are the spies. Official ones. Households often planted servants in rival courts. A footman might return from a week-long visit to another estate with news about alliances, affairs, or who's secretly on bad terms with the king's brother. Espionage wasn't just for the battlefield. Drawing rooms were battlegrounds, too. You sip your wine slowly, wondering who's watching. The servant at your elbow? The gardener who always seems to be trimming hedges within earshot? The chamberlain with an oddly specific knowledge of your receipts? You smile at them all, polite and impenetrable. And of course, some servants become legends. There was Madame de Pompadour's hairdresser, who once caused a scandal by publishing a book of secrets. Or the manservant of a certain Venetian noble who was found to be writing detailed journals about every dinner party, complete with side commentary. The noble's reputation never recovered. But the servant? He got a small book deal in a quiet house by the sea. You nod to your maid. She steps forward with a perfectly timed correction to your sleeve. The room sees nothing but grace. But you feel the quiet message in the way her fingers pinch the lace. She knows. She remembers. And she chooses, for now, not to speak. Because luxury may isolate you from mud, work, and discomfort, but never from people. And in a house full of ears, your own walls are the ones whispering. You retreat from the reception room, desperate for air not steeped in court intrigue and bergamot, and duck into your private quarters, though private still includes a valet, a maid, a canary, and at least one dog who follows you like a tiny, hairy tax deduction. Lapdogs were essential to noble life, not just for company, but for image. They were symbols of refinement, devotion, and the fact that you didn't need a working dog. You were far too important to herd sheep. Your dog is named something elaborate, like Fiddly du Soleil, but you call him Pip. Pip shivers. You shiver. Neither of you has had a proper bath this week. Your dog, despite being brushed daily, is a walking flea colony. He sleeps in your bed, eats off your plate, and wears a velvet coat that costs more than most people's funerals. But oh, he's loyal. Or at least he tolerates your presence when snacks are involved. And he's not alone. The wealthy love their animals. Monkeys, parrots, ferrets, squirrels on leashes. Your cousin once brought a hedgehog to Massachusetts. The king's mistress in France had a pair of white pigeons that wore matching ribbons. In Vienna, one archduchess housed a miniature deer in her salon. She claimed it helped her pray. Historians still argue whether these pets were truly adored or merely curated, another layer of decoration, like furniture that blinked. But records show that noble wills sometimes included provisions for animals. One count left an entire vineyard to his spaniel. The spaniel never drank the profits. That we know of. Still, as charming as they look, these animals were rarely healthy. Your monkey wears a tiny jacket embroidered with your initials, but also has worms. Your sister's parrot mimics phrases it heard during a family fight and now repeats, "Don't look at me in that tone," every time someone passes. Fleas, lice, and various unmentionable mites jump between pets and people like gossip at a duchess's luncheon. You once blamed a rash on your perfume. It turned out to be bird lice. From a parrot. That belonged to a cardinal. Awkward. And yet, you keep them. You dote on them. You feed Pip the crusts of your goose pie while scratching the back of your wig. There's something soothing about these tiny, sniffling creatures who don't care about titles or inheritance, just whether you'll drop a crumb. Sometimes they're even useful. Your falcon, for instance, once brought down a goose during a hunt, earning you applause and a week of smug superiority. He also later ate one of your gloves, but still, nobility is about the gesture. Of course, not all pets were well trained. A visiting baron once brought a goat to a banquet. It chewed on the bishop's robe. No one said a word. The goat was wearing a bell made of gold. Later, it urinated on a tapestry that had taken 2 years to weave. Still no comment. You glance at Pip now, curled in your elbow, snoring through his nose with a tiny whistle that sounds like an old drawer. You know he's probably crawling with things. But what can you do? He's yours. And anyway, you're no cleaner. He's just more honest about it. To keep up appearances, you'll have him brushed again in the morning. He'll be dusted with powdered lavender and maybe dressed in that absurd little ruff that matches your collar. People will compliment him. They'll marvel. They'll never suspect he bit your aunt's slipper last week and buried it in the ash pile. In many ways, your pets are the most sincere part of your life. They don't care how high your wig sits or whether you remembered which fork to use. They love you with muddy paws and flea-bitten tails. And you? You love them back, with embroidered cushions, meat scraps, and immunity from rules. So yes, your world is overrun with parasites. But at least some of them wag their tails when you enter the room. Night has finally crept across the estate, cloaking your ornate world in a hush of candlelight and velvet shadows. You yawn, not elegantly, but with the kind of jaw-cracking weariness that only aristocratic discomfort can bring. Time for sleep. Again. Though calling it sleep might be generous. Because here's the twist, sleep wasn't one long, uninterrupted stretch. It came in 2 shifts. First sleep and second sleep. You'd drift off shortly after dusk, then wake sometime after midnight, eyes open in the cold dark, mind alert, body stiff under too many layers of fabric and disappointment. Historians still argue whether this segmented sleep pattern was universal or more pronounced in pre-industrial societies, but there's ample evidence in diaries, letters, and medical texts that people expected to be awake in the middle of the night. And what did they do during this interval? Oh, just a little bit of everything. You might pray. You might read. You might have quiet conversation, though nothing too exciting, lest it wake the household. If you're feeling brave, you might even write letters by candlelight, your quill scratching across parchment while your chambermaid snores gently in the corner. The room is quiet, except for the occasional crackle of fire or the scurry of something that shouldn't be in the walls. You lie still beneath a mountain of quilts and bed hangings, which were meant to block drafts but mostly trap stale breath and the smell of old feathers. You think of warm milk, but the kitchen is too far and your slippers too thin. Instead, you roll onto your side, facing the tapestry that watches you like a judgmental ancestor. You wonder how many others stare at this same lion-shaped blur during their second sleep, wondering whether they'd ever feel rested. And then there's the bed itself, still massive, still creaky, still faintly alive with the sound of wood expanding or insects having meetings beneath the frame. The mattress shifts as you move. Somewhere, a seam lets out a soft pop, and you pray it's not the beginning of a collapse. Sleep is a public ritual, even in private. You've already done your getting into bed performance in front of your chambermaid. You let her brush your hair, pull up the covers, maybe even warm the footstone. And now, alone-ish, you try to relax your face, in case anyone walks in. You wouldn't want to be caught looking tired. You try counting prayers. You try counting debts. Neither works. Your brain won't stop spinning. Did the steward seem too familiar with the lady in blue? Did your cousin's compliment about your wig contain a hidden barb? Should you have said bless you when the bishop sneezed twice? Eventually, sometime before dawn, sleep creeps back in. You slip into second sleep with a shiver and a sigh, only to be woken an hour later by bells tolling for morning prayer or, worse, the thud of someone delivering a pitcher of lukewarm water directly onto your floor. You rise slowly, joints popping like a broken marionette. Your hair is matted, your face powdered onto the pillow, and the footman is knocking. He doesn't wait for a reply. The day must begin again. But you're already tired. And the worst part? This is normal. You've never known the deep, silent darkness of 8 hours under a duvet. You know fragmented dozing, cold sheets, midnight whispers. That's your luxury. So tonight, once again, you lie beneath brocade and moths, wake somewhere in the hollow hours, and wonder if comfort is just a story people tell children to help them fall asleep. You wake, again, in the half-dark with a jolt, not from a bad dream, but from a distant crack. At first you think it's thunder. Then you remember, it's probably your decor misbehaving. Because your home, for all its velvet drapes and gilded frames, is a fire hazard wrapped in luxury. You blink through the pre-dawn haze, staring up at the canopy above your bed, a majestic thing, embroidered, tasseled, and possibly full of silverfish. Those draperies weren't just for style. They trapped heat, muffled sound, and occasionally caught stray embers from the fireplace. So did tapestries, rugs, and your cousin's coat once, but we don't talk about that anymore. Rich interiors were beautiful and wildly flammable. Walls lined with woolen hangings, floors scattered with rushes or woven mats, ceilings crisscrossed with wooden beams. Open flames flickered in every corner. It was like living inside a scented bonfire and hoping nothing sneezed too hard. Historians still debate how often fires broke out in noble homes. Some claim it was rare, servants were trained, hearths were tended. Others argue it was so common that people barely flinched. Oh, just the East Wing. Again, either way, many great estates have burned, more than once, often thanks to a single candle left too close to someone's poetry. You sit up, rub your eyes, and sniff. No smoke. Good. You swing your legs out of bed and promptly stub your toe on a foot warmer. It's gone cold, now just a brass box with soot inside. You shiver, glance around your ornate prison of comfort, and remember the horror story your steward told last week about a nobleman whose drapes caught while he was trimming his beard. The beard was never found. Your day begins with trepidation. You light a candle using a taper from the hearth, watching the tiny flame dance like a smug omen. The wick sputters once, ominously, and you move it away from the linen sleeve of your dressing robe. Last month, Lady Delphine leaned too close to her breakfast candle and set her sleeve alight. She extinguished it with a glass of wine. Some called it poetic. Others called it Tuesday. And it's not just fire. The decor itself is trying to kill you. That chandelier? Suspended by a questionable length of chain, polished weekly by a servant who insists on humming dirges while up a ladder. The carved bedposts? Termite-riddled oak painted to look like mahogany. You know this because one post collapsed during your uncle's nap. Tapestries, while grand, often in unpleasant surprises, cracked plaster, damp stone, mice, or on one memorable occasion, a cat that had climbed inside during a thunderstorm and refused to leave. It lived there for a week. No one noticed until it yelled during a harpsichord recital. Even the cushions aren't safe. Stuffed with horsehair, down, or straw, they're magnets for insects and mold. You once found something growing under a settee cushion that was either a mushroom or the start of a small revolution. And don't get started on the mirrors. Expensive, flawed, and prone to eerie reflections. You once caught a glimpse of yourself from the wrong angle and thought a ghost had entered the room. It was just your wig slumped sideways. Still, you didn't sleep for 3 days. You descend the stairs cautiously, hands skimming the tapestry-lined walls. The marble step near the landing is cracked. You remember the last time you slipped there, it was raining, your shoes were new, and your dignity never fully recovered. Someone embroidered a pillow commemorating it. Down in the great hall, the staff are already at work replacing rushes and adjusting sconces. A servant delicately untangles a length of ivy from the fireplace, decorative, but now singed at the edges. Another is brushing ashes from a tapestry with a tool that looks like it once belonged to a horse. You sit in your chair, the one with the least splinters, and stare at the room. It's beautiful. It's a masterpiece. It's also trying to kill you in at least 3 subtle ways before lunch. But you're used to it. Wealth is not about comfort. It's about danger in disguise. You learn to live with the creaks, the cracks, the curtain that flutters when no window is open. Maybe it's a draft. Maybe it's something else. You won't ask. You wrap your robe tighter and sip your wine. It's 7 a.m. You deserve it. After all, your wallpaper might combust at any moment. Cheers. You're summoned, with dramatic emphasis, to another banquet. Because if there's one thing the rich do excessively, it's eating meals they'll regret, surrounded by people they dislike, seated for so long that the chairs leave permanent impressions in their soul. You arrive fashionably late, which is to say just early enough to get a good seat but not early enough to be forced into pre-dinner small talk. The hall is blazing with candlelight, chandeliers dripping wax into the punch, and a musician tuning an instrument that seems to have only 2 functional strings. The table stretches so far you're not entirely sure if the person at the other end is real or a cleverly arranged mannequin. You take your seat, which has a little embroidered cushion, stuffed with goose down, perhaps, or disillusionment. To your left, a marquis with gout. To your right, a baroness who once fainted because her soup was looking at her. The first course is served. It's soup. Again. Always soup. Lukewarm, thick, and unidentifiable. Possibly parsnip. Possibly regret. You sip politely while trying not to inhale the scent of whatever the marquis has chosen to douse himself in, probably musk and unspoken childhood trauma. Banquets are meant to be enjoyable. They are not. They are endurance tests disguised as celebrations. You must smile, nod, and laugh at jokes that feel like they've been soaked in damp parchment. Every compliment is a trap. Every toast is a marathon. And the food? It comes in waves. Trays of meat sculpted into the shape of mythical creatures. Fish dressed like birds. Birds stuffed with smaller birds. One dish appears to be an entire roasted swan, refeathered post-mortem. Historians still argue whether these feasts were meant to impress or intimidate. You lean toward the latter. By the 3rd course, your corset is staging a rebellion. The gouty marquis next to you is telling a story about his time in Venice that involves a gondola, 3 oysters, and a misunderstanding with a nun. You nod along, eyes glassy, brain floating somewhere above your powdered wig. Entertainment begins. Jugglers, a jester, a boy with a flute who looks like he was bribed with a potato to perform. One noble brings out a trained parrot that recites a psalm, followed by a swear word. The baroness gasps. The marquis wheezes. You consider fleeing into the dessert tray. But you stay, because leaving early is political suicide. You endure all 12 courses, including the one that looks suspiciously like lark but might be hedgehog. You sip wine that tastes faintly of almonds and paranoia. You laugh at someone's anecdote about getting lost in their own stables. You try to ignore the servant behind you who drops a fork and audibly sighs. Finally, the final course, sugar sculptures, marzipan animals, candied rose petals. You eat none of it. You can't eat any more. Your stomach is filled with duck, confusion, and existential dread. But you take a candied walnut anyway. Just to be polite. The toasts begin. You raise your goblet and listen to increasingly slurred tributes to the host, To the king, to the concept of excellence, one man toasts a tapestry. Another proposes marriage to the dessert. Everyone claps. You try to excuse yourself. But wait, the dancing has started. Of course it has. You're swept into a set of slow, clumsy minuets. The floorboards creak under the weight of powdered shoes and social obligation. You circle, bow, curtsy, step on someone's train, pretend not to notice. Your wig slips half an inch to the left. You keep smiling. Eventually, mercifully, it ends. You're released. You nod your goodbyes, your face frozen in aristocratic politeness, and escape to the hallway. Behind you, laughter continues. Somewhere, the parrot swears again. You've survived the banquet. You're full, exhausted, slightly poisoned, and spiritually bruised. But you did it, and you'll do it again next week. Because nothing says wealth like being too important to decline a terrible invitation. You finally return to your room, bones creaking, shoes scuffed, corset whispering threats, and think, thank heaven that's over. But it's not. Not yet. Because as any respectable noble knows, your day isn't complete without fashioning yourself into a slow-moving sculpture of social suffering. Time for the evening wear. The real stuff. You peel off layers like a molting bird. The gown you wore to dinner lies in a puddle of silk and sweat on the floor. You feel 10 pounds lighter and only mildly closer to freedom. But instead of crawling into bed, you're slipping into another outfit, one meant solely to be seen, not endured for long. Tonight, it's a robe de chamber. Soft, expensive, embroidered with enough gold thread to pay for a small village's candle supply. It's considered casual, but casual here still involves a waist sash that takes 2 people to knot and sleeves wide enough to conceal small livestock. Fashion, at this level, isn't about comfort. It's about symbolism. Every fold of fabric says, I am powerful. Every jeweled pin says, don't speak to me unless your title begins with grand. Your shoes? Less footwear, more miniature sculptures designed to test your balance and patience. And this isn't a new phenomenon. Throughout history, nobles wore their wealth like armor. In the 1500s, slashing, yes, literally cutting the fabric to let contrasting material puff out, was a major trend. It said, I can afford to ruin my own clothes. In the 1700s, panniers, those enormous side hoops, expanded skirts to doorframe destroying widths. Why? Because walking sideways into rooms was elegance. Historians still debate whether these trends were born of aesthetic intent or just one-upmanship gone feral. Probably both. One queen's dress reportedly required 300 yards of fabric in its own carriage. She wore it once and declared it a fine prison. You relate. Tonight's look is more restrained, a little embroidery at the hem, some semi-lethal hairpins, and enough rings to turn your fingers into blunt instruments. You sit at your vanity, dabbing your wrists with perfume that smells like crushed violets and ancient judgment. Then the real danger arrives, shoes. Evening slippers with narrow heels and pointed toes, fashionable, dainty, and completely incapable of supporting the weight of even mild dignity. You wobble to your feet, back straight, knees already preparing their revenge. You're not meant to walk in these shoes. You're meant to arrive. In the mirror, you look like the portrait of Grace. In reality, one misstep on a rug and you're a cautionary tale. One lady at court once fell down 3 stairs, broke a rib, and insisted it was an opportunity to rest. She received flowers. You remember. And then there's the hair. Your wig is redone, powdered again, and adorned with accessories. Feathers, pearls, maybe a miniature carriage made of silk ribbon. It's festive. It's absurd. It's taller than your actual head. At one party, a duchess wore a wig featuring a full model of a battlefield. It started to smoke from candle proximity. She danced anyway. But perhaps the most iconic horror of noble fashion is the corset. Even at night, even when seated in your own room, you're never entirely without its grip. It shapes you. It scolds you. It's the silent partner in every breath you take. Historians still argue how tight corsets actually were, but tight enough that fainting couches became furniture staples. Tight enough. You once stood for 2 hours in a receiving line, smiling while a metal whalebone stayed dug into your ribs. By the end, you could barely taste your teeth. Still, you endured. Because unshaped waists were considered untrustworthy. Or worse, provincial. Even men weren't spared. Their doublets were padded, their breeches stuffed, their calves encased in stockings so tight they had to be peeled off like fruit. Heels were worn by men long before women made them iconic, because height equaled power, and if you could teeter dramatically while delivering a diplomatic insult, you'd won. Tonight, you don't even have a function to attend. This is just to be seen by guests walking the halls, or your maid, or possibly a footman you suspect keeps a fashion journal. You'll parade for a few minutes, endure a compliment about your ethereal glow, which is probably sweat, then retreat to unlace it all before bed. But here's the truth, you love it. Not the discomfort, no. But the spectacle. The transformation. The moment when the candles catch your silhouette and someone, just for a second, thinks you look like royalty carved from marble and misery. Then your slipper squeaks. The illusion cracks. You smirk at yourself in the mirror. It's all absurd. But so is wealth. And if you're going to suffer, you might as well look magnificent doing it. The fire in your chamber has burned low. Shadows flicker across the walls, climbing the velvet drapes and dancing across your tired face. You've finally peeled off your evening attire, set the wig gently back on its porcelain stand like it's a sleeping pet, and now, in the hush between yawns, you're struck by something you try not to think about too often: loneliness. Yes, you're rich. In embroidered robes, in land deeds, in tea imported from 5 time zones away. But in people? In joy? In warmth that isn't from a brazier? Less so. You stretch, slowly, bones popping like rain on a copper roof, and settle into a chair by the hearth. The embers glow. The room is silent, except for the occasional creak, wood expanding, house settling, or perhaps a ghost. You wouldn't be surprised. The rich leave many things behind. Some of them whisper. You remember the portraits in the hallway. Ancestors with grim eyes and tight mouths, swaddled in layers of status. Their frames are gold, but their stares are heavy. You once counted how many looked happy. It didn't take long. Historians still argue whether the melancholy of the upper class was caused by boredom, guilt, or the crushing weight of maintaining appearance. But those who wrote letters, kept journals, even scribbled into the margins of cookbooks, all echo one thing: it was lonely at the top. Especially if you didn't like who you'd stepped on to get there. And it's not just the absence of affection, it's the caution. Every word you speak must be calculated. Every sigh might be overheard. You laugh carefully, love conditionally, and trust almost no one. Because wealth attracts people. But it rarely brings connection. Even family becomes transactional. Your brother eyes your inheritance. Your cousin spreads rumors to outmaneuver you for a title. Your aunt suggests a marriage that sounds more like a hostage exchange than a partnership. And through it all, you nod, smile, and drink the tea that someone else may have poisoned. Your servants, for all their closeness, are bound by duty. They may care for you, but they are paid to. They may listen, but they don't confide. And even if they did, you wouldn't be sure if it was kindness or strategy. Everyone in your orbit has a reason. You just hope it's not a sharp one. You shift in your chair, watching the fire fade. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, you imagine the mice are living in warmth and laughter, cuddled close, free of powdered wigs and poisoned rouge. You envy them, just a little. And what of love? Oh, it exists, sure, but mostly in whispers. In exchanged glances. In brief touches between dance steps. Grand romances are rare, and even rarer when they don't threaten an estate or offend someone's uncle. You once had a love letter slipped into your fan. It smelled like ink and desperation. You burned it, but not before memorizing the handwriting. There's a phrase you once read in a book, a monk's diary, long before the invention of doublet buttons. To be rich is to own time, but never to spend it. You think about that as the flames wink out. You have leisure, yes, but it's filled with duties. You have space, yes, but it echoes. You have comfort, yes, but it's always cold. You rise, slowly, and climb into bed. The sheets are chilled, the blankets stiff with embroidery, and your feet ache beneath them. You pull the hangings closed around the bed. You are alone, but not unobserved. Your ancestors watch from paintings. Your servants wait beyond the door. Your own thoughts turn traitor. And yet, you sleep. Because what else can you do? Morning returns not as a gentle caress but as a shrill, bell-clanging obligation. You're roused before you're ready, by the clang of shutters opening, the scraping of logs being replaced in the hearth, and the soft, careful footsteps of a servant trying not to wake you and absolutely failing. You don't open your eyes yet. You lie there, tangled in sheets that never quite warm, under a canopy that sags slightly from age and dust. The chill creeps in again, through floorboards, through stone walls, through your spine. The fire's died down. Your bones have not. But you must rise. There are letters to answer. A cousin to avoid. A wig to endure. You pull the bed hangings back and swing your legs over the side, into your slippers, which are soft but somehow always damp. Another mystery that wealth never solved. Today will be like yesterday, and the day before that. More layers. More feasts. More conversation carefully curated to say nothing at all. You'll ride through your estate in a carriage that shudders over every stone. You'll nod at the tenants, who pretend not to notice your wince each time the wheel jerks. You'll host someone who eats more than he listens and leave your own banquet hungrier than you arrived. Historians still debate whether the routines of the nobility created a culture of refinement or just endless ritualized tedium. But to you, it feels like one long loop stitched with embroidery, scented with too much rosewater, and padded with cushions no one ever relaxes on. You wash your face with cold water from a gilded bowl. You dry it with a towel embroidered with your family crest, a lion biting a rose, which feels appropriate. You sit while your maid brushes out your hair, both of you pretending that this is an intimate moment and not a chore. You stare at your reflection, powdered pale, framed in gold. Behind you, on the vanity, a fly buzzes lazily near a dish of potpourri. You flick it away with a fingertip. It lands again. Stubborn. Like you. You could scream. But what would that accomplish? You've seen richer men go mad trying to change the furniture. You've seen women smile through clenched teeth until their molars cracked. You've seen children groomed into mannequins for dynastic ambitions. All under this same painted ceiling. And yet, you do what all the others did. You dress. You smile. You walk out into the hallway, where your echo is the first to greet you. Your lapdog scampers behind you, fleas and all. A maid curtsies. A steward bows. You nod. You are, after all, wealthy, fortunate, lucky, so very lucky, and haunted. By ancestors, by duty, by tapestries that whisper when the wind is just right. You pass a portrait of your grandfather, whose eyes follow you down the corridor. You pass another of your great-aunt, who looks like she knows your secrets. You stop by the window, look out at the grounds, and wonder, for the 1000th time, what it might be like to trade all this for a plain room and warm feet. But no! That's not how this works. The price of wealth isn't paid once. It's paid every day. In discomfort, in duty, in the quiet, aching absence of joy. And so, with posture perfect and fingers numb, you step into your day. Again. So here you are, the candles guttered, the fire mere embers, the velvet hush settling over your imagined castle. You've wandered through halls of splendor and discomfort, through banquet rooms and bedchambers, and perhaps, just perhaps, you feel a little less envious of the golden cages nobles once called home. Because wealth didn't always mean ease. It meant performance, pressure, layers of fabric, and expectation, and furniture that looked better than it felt. It meant a life full of eyes, painted, living, invisible, all watching. It meant aching feet, powdered lungs, friendships tangled in etiquette, and rest that never quite arrived. And now, as your breathing slows, and the images of flickering chandeliers and laced sleeves drift into soft focus, you can let go. Let the echoing corridors fall silent. Let the fire go out. Let the heavy curtains of history draw themselves close, one gentle fold at a time. You don't need a powdered wig or a 12-course feast. You don't need a jeweled goblet or a chandelier the size of a horse cart. All you need now is the quiet, the softness of your pillow, the steady rhythm of your breath, and the simple comfort of being still. You're here. You're warm. And no one expects you to say anything clever. So sleep now, traveler of time. Leave the castles behind. Let the ghosts gossip without you. Let the gowns sag, the silver tarnish, the history wait. You've survived the luxury of misery. You've earned your rest. Sweet dreams.